Who let this kid in here? The voice cut across the gym like a slap. Marcus Webb. Every trophy in the hallway had his name on it, stood in the center of the floor, looking at the new boy like he was something that had wandered in off the street. 50 athletes stopped moving. The new boy had a worn duffel bag, a broken zipper, and shoes held together at the heel with athletic tape. He'd been at Ironwood Boxing Academy for less than 4 minutes. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The boy set his bag down, slowly. Then he walked to the equipment rack and started wrapping his hands like no one had said a word. Marcus watched him. Something shifted behind his eyes. He had no idea what he'd just walked into. Blake Foster had been boxing since he was 12 years old, in a garage 2 blocks from his mother's apartment that smelled like rubber mats and motor oil. No coach, no ring, just a heavy bag duct taped to a ceiling beam and a boy who showed up every day after school because the alternative was the street, and the street had already taken enough from his neighborhood. His mother, Diane, worked the night shift at a garment factory off the interstate. She came home at 6 in the morning with her hands stiff and her eyes tired, and she never once told him to quit. She just asked if he'd eaten, and when he said yes, she believed him even when the fridge said otherwise. By the time Blake was 16, people in the neighborhood knew his name, not from school, from the amateur circuit. Small venues, folding chairs, judges who wrote scores on paper napkins. He won 14 of his first 17 bouts, and the 3 he lost taught him more than the 14 combined. He learned that power without timing was just effort. He learned that the fighter who stays calm in the 3rd round usually wins it. When a video of one of his sparring sessions found its way onto a coaching forum, head coach Raymond Wilson of Ironwood Boxing Academy watched it twice. The second time, he watched with the sound off. He wanted to see the footwork without the noise. What he saw was a teenager moving like someone who had been trained for years. The head movement, the weight transfer, the way the boy reset his stance after every exchange as if he were checking a list only he could see. Wilson made one phone call. Blake received a full scholarship 3 weeks later. Ironwood sat 2 hours north of the city, tucked behind a state forest and a long access road that felt longer in January. The academy had been running for 22 years and had produced 3 national youth champions. Its hallways smelled like liniment and old wood, and every surface that could hold a trophy did. The boys who came here were already good. The ones who stayed became something else. Blake arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September with a duffel bag that had a broken zipper on the front pocket and a pair of boxing shoes where the left sole had started to separate at the heel. He'd patched it with athletic tape the night before. It held well enough. The main gym was large and loud and smelled exactly like the garage back home, which helped. 2 rings occupied the center of the floor. Heavy bags lined the far wall. About 30 athletes were already in the middle of their morning session, skipping rope, hitting mitts, stretching in pairs along the mat. Blake was watching the room when the laughter started. Marcus Webb didn't walk across a gym so much as he moved through it, the way water finds the lowest point without thinking about it. He was 19 years old, a 3rd-year athlete who had spent the better part of his time at Ironwood collecting titles and the kind of unspoken authority that tends to follow them. He was built like someone who had never missed a training session, with hands that had already won 2 national junior titles and a way of looking at people that made them feel they owed him something. He crossed the floor in 8 or 9 strides, stopped in front of Blake, and looked him over the way you'd look at a car with a dent in the hood. Who let this kid in here? The room responded the way rooms do when someone powerful decides something is funny. Not everyone laughed, but enough did that the sound became a wall, and Blake stood on the inside of it, duffel bag still in his hand, shoes still taped at the heel. He said nothing. He set the bag down beside the equipment rack, unzipped the working pocket, and took out his hand wraps. He started with the left hand the way the older man from the garage, who had shown up one afternoon when Blake was 13 and never really left, had taught him. Thumb first. 3 loops at the wrist. 4 across the knuckles. Marcus watched him do it. Then he got bored and walked away. That was the first morning. What followed those first days was not loud. Marcus Webb did not operate loudly. He understood that loud drew attention, and attention could complicate things. What he did instead was quiet and consistent and effective. He controlled the gym the way some students control a classroom. Not through anything written down, but through a system everyone understood and no one discussed. The best training slots at Ironwood ran from 9 to 11 in the morning, when the gym was fully lit and both assistant coaches were present and the equipment was fresh. Marcus had those slots. His crew of 4 or 5 athletes had the hours immediately after. Everyone else arranged themselves around what remained. Blake was given a slot at 5:30 in the morning. The overhead lights in the main gym didn't fully warm up until 6, so for the first 30 minutes he worked by the light that came in through the high windows along the east wall, gray and thin and good enough. He didn't complain. He was used to imperfect conditions. The garage had no heat in winter. The harder thing was the sparring assignments. In the first 2 weeks, Blake was consistently paired with athletes who outweighed him by 15 or 20 pounds. This was arranged to look like standard rotation. Coach Reardon, who managed the daily schedule, signed off on each pairing with the same expression he used for everything. Neutral, unhurried, already thinking about something else. When the size mismatches produced predictable results, Reardon noted them in the evaluation log with clinical brevity. Foster struggled against stronger opponents, conditioning concerns. What Reardon did not note was who had requested those pairings. Blake absorbed the sparring sessions the way he absorbed most things, by watching more than reacting, by finding the pattern, by waiting. He didn't always win the exchanges, but he never got hurt, which, given the weight differences, said more than the scores did. Outside the gym, the isolation was simpler and more complete. Nobody shared equipment with him without being asked twice. Nobody saved him a spot at the training table or slid a water bottle his way between rounds. The boys who might have been friendly kept a distance that had nothing to do with Blake personally and everything to do with the cost of being seen as his ally. He ate his meals at the end of the long table in the dining hall and read the form charts he'd printed from the National Rankings website. He slept 7 hours. He iced his hands before bed. He called his mother twice a week. On a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of September, a notice went up on the main board outside the athletic director's office. Blake read it on his way back from dinner. The text was straightforward. At the end of the fall semester, Ironwood would hold an internal selection tournament. One athlete would earn the Academy's single entry slot into the National Youth Boxing Championship. The entry came with a full travel and competition stipend and, in a clause near the bottom of the notice that most athletes skimmed past, a family medical benefit for the duration of the championship season, covering one immediate family member of the selected athlete. Blake read that clause 3 times. He called his mother that night. Diane answered on the second ring, and he could hear that she was already in bed, which meant she hadn't gone into work. "You okay?" he asked. She said she was tired, that's all. The doctor had used a word at the last appointment that she didn't want to repeat over the phone, but it had to do with her heart, and they wanted to run more tests, and the tests cost money they didn't have sitting around. Blake listened. He asked the questions that needed asking. He told her the tests would happen, that she shouldn't worry about the money part right now. After he hung up, he sat in the hallway outside his room for a while with his back against the cinder block wall and his hands resting on his knees. The building was quiet. Down the corridor, someone's alarm was set wrong and buzzed for a few seconds before going silent. The selection tournament. 1 slot. A medical benefit for one immediate family member. He went back to the board the next morning before the 5:30 session and signed his name in the open registration column. He did it in small, clear letters. He didn't tell anyone. 2 days later, Marcus Webb found out. Blake didn't know how. He didn't need to. In a closed environment like Ironwood, information moved the way heat moved, toward everywhere at once, through walls, through doors, finding every gap. Marcus knew by Saturday. By Sunday, the temperature in the gym had changed again, and Blake felt it the moment he walked in for his morning session. The difference was not dramatic. It was a degree or two colder than before, the way a room changes when someone in it has made a decision about you. Marcus didn't say anything directly. He didn't need to. The message arrived through the sparring rotation, through the equipment that was always already being used when Blake needed it, through the small daily frictions that, taken alone, meant nothing, and taken together meant exactly what they were intended to mean. Blake wrapped his hands and started his session. He had signed the registration. He had a reason that had nothing to do with Marcus Webb and everything to do with a woman in an apartment 2 hours south who was waiting on test results. The rest was just weather, and he had trained in worse. What? The morning sessions at 5:30 had one advantage Blake had not anticipated. Nobody else was there. The gym at that hour belonged entirely to him. The heavy bags, the mirrors, the open floor. He could work without being watched, which meant he could work without performing, and there was a difference between the two that most people never learned to feel. He used those hours carefully. Not for conditioning, he did that in the evenings, running the access road in the dark. The mornings were for technique. He would spend 40 minutes on a single combination, breaking it down the way a musician breaks down a passage, running it slowly until it stopped feeling like thought and started feeling like reflex. Then he would move to the next thing. He had been doing this since October. By the time November arrived, the combinations had become automatic enough that he could run them at full speed without losing the form. He knew this not because anyone told him, but because he could feel the difference in the bag, the sound it made, the way it moved. What he did not know was that any of this was visible from the outside. Raymond Wilson had a habit of arriving at the gym earlier than his schedule required. He said it was because he liked the building before it got loud. The truth was closer to something he'd never said aloud. He did his best thinking in that hour, walking the floor while the equipment was still and the light was low, and no one needed anything from him yet. He had noticed Blake's 5:30 session sometime in the second week of October. He stood near the equipment room doorway and watched for 10 or 15 minutes, then went to his office and drank his coffee and thought about what he'd seen. He watched for 3 more mornings before he stopped counting them. What he saw was not what he had expected from the scholarship video, which had already been impressive. The video had shown a raw fighter with instincts. What the morning sessions showed was a fighter who had taken those instincts and submitted them to a longer, quieter discipline. The boy was not just talented. He was doing the work that talent alone never bothered to do. Wilson said nothing about it. He kept his observations in the small notebook he carried in his left breast pocket, in handwriting nobody else could read comfortably. In the gym, Marcus escalated the way he always did when something stopped going according to plan. Not loudly, but more completely. The sparring mismatches continued. The equipment disappeared from where Blake left it. But Marcus added a layer that was harder to see and harder to document. He started talking. Not to Blake. Never directly to Blake where it could be witnessed and named. He talked to the room in general, in the way that some people talk to a crowd while looking at one person. He mentioned, in passing, during the kind of conversation that happened between sets and water breaks, that the new scholarship kid had never competed in a sanctioned event, that his record was from an amateur circuit so informal it barely counted, that the video everyone had apparently been impressed by was just a garage session. No judge, no referee, no real pressure. Put anybody in a garage with a bag and enough time, and you can make it look like anything you want. The comment landed in the room and spread through it the way those comments do. Not as an accusation, just as a thought, available for anyone who wanted to pick it up. Some of them did. Not out of cruelty, but because it was easier to agree with someone like Marcus than to form an independent opinion about a person nobody knew yet. Blake had given them very little to work with. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He didn't lose his temper when the sparring got rough. To a certain kind of observer, that restraint looked like absence, like there wasn't much there. They were looking at the wrong thing. In the third week of October, Coach Reardon posted the schedule for the mandatory mid-semester sparring evaluation. Every athlete in the selection pool would be assessed by the coaching staff during a single session. Movement, defense, reaction time, overall composure under pressure. The evaluations would contribute to the selection committee's final scoring. When Blake checked the posted pairings, he found his name across from Dion Carter. Dion was a second-year athlete, 17 years old, with a physical frame that had arrived about 2 years ahead of the rest of him. He weighed in at 172 pounds on a lean day. Blake was at 154. Dion had a right hand that coaches sometimes describe using the word heavy, and he liked to use it early, often, and without much concern for what came back. The pairing was not random. Blake knew it. He suspected most of the room knew it. He showed up for the evaluation the same way he showed up for everything. Early, wraps already done, shoes laced before he sat down. The gym was full for these sessions in a way it wasn't for regular training. Athletes who weren't being evaluated that hour still came to watch. Marcus stood near the far wall with his arms folded, positioned where he could see the ring clearly and where Blake could see him seeing it. The bell rang for the first round. Dion came forward the way he always did, direct, confident, his right hand already loaded. He threw it within the first 15 seconds, a clean shot aimed at the side of Blake's head. Blake moved 2 inches to the left. The punch went past his ear. He didn't counter. He reset his stance and circled away. Dion threw again, a combination this time, jab, then right hand. Blake slipped the jab, let the right hand graze his shoulder rather than his jaw, and stepped out of range before Dion could reset. The first round went like this: Dion attacking, Blake not being there when the punches arrived. It looked, to someone watching casually, like Blake was running, like he was surviving rather than fighting. Reardon, sitting at the scoring table, made notes with an expression that suggested he was confirming something he already believed. Wilson sat beside Reardon. He was not making notes. He was watching Blake's feet. The second round started the same way. Dion pushed forward with more pressure. Shorter punches, cutting off the ring, trying to eliminate the angles Blake kept finding. For the first minute, he succeeded. Blake was in the corner twice, working his way out without taking clean shots, but visibly working harder to do it. Then something shifted. Blake stopped moving laterally and started moving forward, not to attack, but to close the distance where Dion's right hand had the least leverage. He was inside the punch before it could develop. Dion, whose power required room to build, found himself throwing short and finding nothing. His rhythm broke. He reset, tried to create space, and in the half-second it took him to step back, Blake threw a single left hook to the body. The sound it made against Dion's ribs was different from every other sound the sparring session had produced. Dion's breath came out all at once. He covered up, which was the right instinct, and Blake stepped back and let him recover. He did not follow. He reset his stance and circled away. Dion recovered within a few seconds. He was tough, and the round ended cleanly. But the room had heard that sound, and the room was quieter now than it had been before. The third round was where the evaluation changed character entirely. Dion came out determined to answer the body shot, which meant he was fighting with a specific agenda instead of his instincts, and fighters with specific agendas are predictable. He threw a jab to create distance, then loaded the right hand with more weight than usual. Blake read it from the moment Dion's shoulder dropped. He slipped the right hand, pivoted on his left foot, and as Dion's momentum carried him forward and slightly off balance, Blake stepped in and threw a short, compact left hook, using the full rotation of his hips, arriving at the exact point where Dion's jaw was moving toward the punch rather than away from it. Dion's legs lost their certainty. He didn't fall. He grabbed the top rope, found his footing, and the referee stepped in to give him a standing count. He was fine, shaken, back on his feet by 3. The round ended 40 seconds later without further incident. The scoring table, Reardon had stopped writing. Wilson had not moved. He was still watching, the way you watch something you want to make sure you've actually seen. He wrote 4 words in the small notebook in his breast pocket, capped the pen, and put it away. After the session ended, Wilson remained at the scoring table a moment longer than necessary. He looked across the floor to where Blake was at the far end, unwrapping his hands alone, back to the room, the same as he'd arrived. Marcus Webb had already left. What happened next arrived through channels Blake had no access to and no warning about. Marcus went to Reardon the following morning, before the first session, which was itself a signal about how seriously he was taking it. He brought a printed copy of the Ironwood Selection Tournament Guidelines and pointed to a section near the back. The section addressed eligibility for the national championship entry slot. It required that competing athletes have a documented record of at least 1 sanctioned competitive bout, defined as any event held under the governance of a recognized regional or national amateur boxing body. Blake's record was from the informal amateur circuit. The bouts had referees and judges, but the events were not registered under any governing body. Technically, on paper, in the language of the guideline, he had 0 sanctioned competitive bouts. Reardon read the section twice. Then he forwarded Blake's application file to the athletic director's office with a note attached, requesting a formal review of the applicant's eligibility. Blake found out from a printed notice slipped under his door on a Wednesday evening. The notice informed him that his participation in the upcoming selection tournament was under review pending clarification of eligibility requirements. A decision would be issued within 48 hours. He read it standing in the doorway of his room, with the hallway light on and the rest of the building quiet. He read it twice, the way his mother had read the doctor's letter, trying to find the sentence that changed the meaning of the one before it. There wasn't one. He put the notice on his desk and sat on the edge of his bed and thought, for the first time since arriving at Ironwood, about what happened if this didn't work. If the review went against him. If the 48 hours ended with his name removed from the registration column. The medical benefit for one immediate family member. His mother waiting on test results 2 hours south. He called her that night and kept his voice level the whole time. She told him she'd eaten a real dinner, that the neighbor's dog had learned to open the gate latch, which she said with enough amusement that it almost made him smile. After he hung up, the room was very quiet. He put on his shoes, walked down to the gym, and worked the heavy bag for an hour under the single utility lamp at the end of the row. It threw a yellow circle on the floor and left everything else in shadow. He worked through the combinations he'd been building since October. Left jab, right cross, short hook. Reset. Again. The bag moved. His breathing evened out. The 48 hours would pass the way 48 hours passed. The decision would be what it was. He could not control the review. He could control what his hands did at 5:30 in the morning. He had always been better at the things he could control. The 48 hours ended on a Friday afternoon. Blake was in his room when the knock came, firm and without hesitation. He opened the door and found Raymond Wilson standing in the hallway, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at Blake with the same expression he'd had at the scoring table after the evaluation. Not warm exactly, but level, present, like someone who had already made a decision and was at peace with it. Wilson said he had reviewed the eligibility question and found it to be a matter of administrative interpretation rather than substantive disqualification. The informal circuit bouts involved referees, judges, and opposing athletes, all the components of genuine competitive experience. The guidelines' intent was to ensure that participants had experience competing under supervised conditions. Blake met that standard. His name remained on the registration list. Wilson turned to go, then stopped and looked back. "The mid-semester evaluation," Wilson said. "That hook in the 3rd round. You loaded it off his shoulder drop. You read the tell before he threw it." Blake said, "Yeah." "How long had you been reading it?" "Since the 1st round," Blake said. Wilson looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way someone nods when a thing they suspected turns out to be true, and walked back down the hallway. Blake closed his door and stood in the middle of his room. He had until morning until his next 5:30 session. He sat down at his desk and opened the form charts. He had a lot left to study. The selection tournament draw went up on a Monday morning. 8 athletes, single elimination, 3 rounds of 3 minutes each, scored by a panel of 3 outside judges that Wilson had brought in. A detail that appeared in small print at the bottom of the notice and that Blake read twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood it. Outside judges. Not Reardon. Not anyone whose career ran through the Webb family's annual contribution to the facility fund. The bracket placed Blake on the opposite side of the draw from Marcus, which meant if both of them won their first 2 bouts, they would meet in the final. Marcus saw the bracket at the same time as everyone else. He studied it for about 4 seconds, then walked away without a word. His expression said what his silence confirmed. He expected to be in the final. The only question in his mind was who would be across from him when he got there. Blake's first bout was against a second-year athlete named Porter, who was technically sound and physically cautious and had a tendency, when pressured, to hold. The bout went the distance. Blake won it on points without throwing anything he hadn't planned to throw. He worked the body in the first round, opened up the head in the second when Porter started dropping his right elbow to protect his ribs, and spent the third round managing distance. The judges scored it unanimously in his favor. He sat in the corner afterward and drank water and watched Marcus dismantle his opponent in the other semifinal. Marcus was good. Blake had known this, but knowing it and watching it were different things. He moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously tested. Fluid, aggressive, completely at home in the ring. His opponent lasted into the second round before the referee stopped the bout on a standing count. Marcus climbed out of the ring without looking winded. He rolled his neck, accepted a water bottle from one of his crew, and then, for the first time all morning, looked directly at Blake across the gym. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Blake looked back at him for a moment, then looked away. He had more important things to think about. Dion Carter, who had lost his semifinal bout to Porter on a split decision, sat at the edge of the bleachers with an ice pack on his right hand, watching the bracket results get posted. He caught Blake's eye once, briefly, and gave a short nod. The kind fighters exchange when a shared experience has settled into something like mutual respect. Blake nodded back. The final was set for the following Saturday morning. By 8:30 on Saturday, the main gym was more crowded than Blake had seen it since arriving. Athletes lined the walls 2 and 3 deep. The folding chairs along the apron were filled. The 3 outside judges sat at the scoring table with their scorecards already out, looking like people who had driven a distance and intended to take it seriously. The chair where Reardon usually sat at evaluations was occupied by a junior coach Blake had seen twice before. Wilson had relieved Reardon of tournament duties 2 days earlier, citing a conflict of interest identified during his review of the eligibility challenge. Reardon had accepted the reassignment without public comment. He was not in the gym that morning. Wilson stood near the corner, clipboard in hand. He glanced at Blake once as Blake climbed through the ropes, gave a single small nod, and went back to his conversation with one of the judges. Blake stood in his corner and looked at the gym. The equipment along the far wall, the high east windows throwing flat winter light across the floor, the faces arranged around the ring. He had been invisible in this building for 3 months. Every 5:30 session, every meal at the end of the long table, every sparring round where nobody had bothered to learn his name before pairing him against someone heavier. He thought of his mother. He had called her the night before and she had asked about the weather up north, the way she always did. He told her it was cold and clear. She said that sounded like good fighting weather, and she said it with a small laugh that he had been holding on to since he hung up. The bell rang. Marcus came out fast, direct, purposeful, filling the space between them with forward momentum before Blake could establish his rhythm. He threw a sharp jab within the first 5 seconds, more as a rangefinder than an attack. Blake slipped it and circled right, and Marcus followed without hesitation, already adjusting. He was better than anyone Blake had faced in the tournament. What Blake also knew from 3 months of watching Marcus move through this gym was the shape of how Marcus fought when things went according to plan, and what happened to that shape when they didn't. The first round was about information. Blake let Marcus set the tempo, let him feel like the round was going the way he expected. Marcus landed 3 clean jabs and a right hand that caught Blake on the shoulder and carried enough weight that Blake felt it in his back. He took them and moved and did not load up in return. He threw his jab to keep Marcus honest and threw nothing else. When the bell ended the first round, the room gave Marcus the benefit of the doubt. He had landed more and pressed forward the whole 3 minutes. Between rounds, Blake sat on the stool and breathed and looked at the water bucket on the floor in front of him. He was not tired. He was thinking. The first round had told him what he needed to know. Marcus's right hand set up off the double jab. Jab, jab, right. And he threw it at the same point in the combination every time, which meant it was drilled rather than read, which meant it was predictable. His footwork was excellent going forward and ordinary going backward, which meant he had never been seriously made to go backward. Blake intended to change that in the second round. He came out with pressure, not aggression, but presence. He walked Marcus down the center of the ring instead of circling away, cutting off the angles, making Marcus move laterally instead of straight ahead. Marcus responded by planting his feet and throwing the double jab, setting up the right hand. Blake slipped the second jab and stepped inside before the right hand could extend, landing a short left hook to the body. Marcus exhaled and clinched, which the referee broke immediately. Marcus reset. His jaw was set differently now, tighter, working. The second time Blake pressured him, Marcus went to the double jab again, faster. Blake slipped the first, took the second on his forearm, and threw the right cross straight down the middle. It caught Marcus clean on the chin, not hard enough to drop him, but hard enough that his next step was sideways instead of forward. The room reacted. Not loudly, but suddenly. A shift in the quality of the silence, a collective intake that meant something had changed. Marcus shook it off. He stayed composed, moved away, bought himself a few seconds of clean air, and came back to center ring with his guard higher than it had been in the first round. The rest of the second round was the tightest 3 minutes of the morning. Marcus threw less and thought more, which made him more dangerous but also slower. Blake kept the pressure constant, not crowding, just there, always one step closer than Marcus wanted him to be. When the bell rang, the judges wrote for longer than they had after the first round. The third round was where Blake had always been most comfortable. He had grown up training without a trainer in the corner. No one to tell him what to do between rounds. No one to carry the information for him. He learned to arrive at the 3rd minute of a third round still thinking clearly when the other fighter was running on instinct and adrenaline. Marcus came out for the third round intending to finish it. Blake could see it in the way he came off the stool. A decision had been made. Marcus was going to throw the right hand at the first clean opportunity with everything he had, and he was betting it would end the conversation. Blake let him think the opportunity had arrived. He moved to his right all through the early part of the round, Marcus's left away from the right hand. Then, at the 2-minute mark, he stopped and reset in a way that was slightly slower than his rhythm all morning, a half beat behind himself. Marcus read the hesitation as fatigue. He planted his left foot, loaded the right hand off the double jab, and threw it with the full weight of his body behind it. Blake slipped left. He had been moving right all morning. The slip arrived from a direction Marcus had not prepared for. The right hand went past Blake's ear, and as Marcus's shoulder came through and his weight followed the punch forward, Blake pivoted on his right foot and threw the hook. Short, tight. The full rotation of his hips behind it, the punch traveling a distance of perhaps 8 inches and landing at the exact point where Marcus's jaw was moving toward it rather than away. The sound it made was clean and final. The sound Blake had been building toward since the first 5:30 session in October, when he ran this combination in a yellow circle of light on an empty floor until it stopped feeling like thought and started feeling like something older than thought. Marcus's legs went. He reached for the top rope with his left hand and found it, which kept him upright, and the referee stepped between them and counted. Marcus was nodding by 3, telling the referee and himself and everyone watching that he was fine, that he was still here, that this was not over. The referee looked at him for a long moment. Then he waved the fight back on. 12 seconds remained in the round. Blake moved to center ring and waited. Marcus came forward, slower now, his hands still up, his footwork still working even if something behind his eyes had gone quiet. Blake threw a single jab that Marcus slipped cleanly, and then the bell rang. The gym erupted, not in celebration exactly, but in the kind of noise a room makes when it has been holding its breath for 9 minutes and finally lets go. Athletes who had not spoken to Blake since September were on their feet. The folding chairs along the apron emptied as people moved toward the ring. Blake stood in the center of the ring and breathed. The judges were writing. The referee was collecting the scorecards. He looked across the ring at Marcus, who was standing in his corner with his back to the room, his gloves resting on the top rope, his head down. Not performing, just somewhere inside himself, in the place fighters go after a thing like this, working through what had happened and what it meant and what came next. Blake crossed the ring and held out his glove. Marcus turned and looked at it and at Blake with an expression that was too complicated to name. Something between pride and the particular exhaustion of a person who has just had a long argument with reality and lost. He touched his glove to Blake's once, firmly, and looked away. The referee raised Blake's hand. The outside judge at the center of the table announced the scores. All 3 judges in favor of Blake Foster, by margins of 3, 4, and 5 points. The room was loud for a long time. In the middle of it, Wilson appeared at the edge of the ring and waited for Blake to climb down. He just stood there until Blake was on the floor beside him, and then he said in the same even voice he used for everything, "The National Championship travel package includes a medical benefit for 1 immediate family member. I'll have the paperwork on your desk by Monday." Blake said thank you. Wilson nodded and walked back toward the scoring table. Blake found a quiet spot near the equipment rack, the same rack where he had taken his hand wraps on the first morning, while Marcus laughed at him from across the room. He sat on the low bench and started unwrapping his hands, left first, then right, rolling the wraps into a neat coil the way he had done since he was 12 years old in a garage that smelled like rubber and motor oil. The gym was still loud around him. People were talking, replaying the 3rd round, doing the thing people do after a close fight where they reconstruct it moment by moment, as if trying to understand how the outcome was possible. He listened to it from a little distance and let it happen without him. He finished rolling the 2nd wrap and put both of them in the front pocket of his duffel bag, the pocket with the broken zipper, which he had been meaning to fix and hadn't gotten around to yet. He stood up. On the other side of the gym, near the exit, he saw Marcus Webb passing through the door into the hallway. Alone this time, without his crew, moving with the quietness of someone who had a long drive back to whatever version of himself existed before this morning. Blake watched him go. Then he picked up his bag and went to find a phone. His mother answered on the 2nd ring. "How'd it go?" she asked. "We're in," he said. The line held something that didn't need words. Then Diane said, "I knew," in the tone she always used when she said it. Not triumphant, just certain, the way someone states a thing they never seriously doubted. "I know you did," Blake said. Outside the academy windows, the access road ran straight through the state forest and out toward the interstate, and eventually, 2 hours south, to an apartment where a woman was sitting with the phone in her hand and the neighbor's dog barking at the gate latch in the background. Blake leaned against the wall of the hallway and stayed on the line a while longer. There was no rush. The morning had gone where it needed to go. He had learned in 3 months at Ironwood that the most important round is never the one everyone watches. It's the one before that, the one at 5:30 in the morning in the underlit gym when no one is keeping score, and the only reason to do the work is because the work is worth doing. He had won 9 minutes in front of 50 people, but he had built those 9 minutes over 90 days when no one was looking. That was the part he would carry forward. Show up. Do the work. Let the rest follow. It always had. There's something about Blake's story that I keep coming back to, and it's not the final punch or the scorecards or the moment his hand got raised. It's the 5:30 sessions. Nobody asked him to be there. Nobody was watching. Nobody was going to give him credit for it or put it in a report. He showed up in a cold gym with a utility lamp and a broken zipper on his bag and did the work anyway, day after day, because he understood something that took most people a long time to learn. The results everyone sees are just the surface of something much longer and much quieter happening underneath. He didn't try to prove anything to Marcus. He didn't argue, didn't fight back through words, didn't spend his energy trying to change what other people thought of him. He just kept doing the one thing that was always in his control. And I think most of us have been in a version of that gym. Maybe not a boxing gym. Maybe it's a job where someone decided what you were before you opened your mouth. Maybe it's a classroom or a team or a situation where you've been counted out so many times that you started to wonder if they were right. Maybe you're in it right now. If you are, I'd genuinely like to know. Not as a prompt, but because the people who leave comments on these stories always end up sharing something real. So if there's a room you've been invisible in, or a version of 5:30 in the morning that only you know about, drop it below. I read every single one. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who's been quietly doing the work without anyone noticing, send this to them. Not with a big explanation, just send it. They'll know why. We'll be back with another story soon. Until then, keep showing up.